Qari Ahmadullah, declared dead, then alive, then disappeared. On December 15, 2008, Pakistani authorities made an announcement that seemed at first routine in the context of the volatile tribal regions along the Afghan border. Qari Ahmadullah, a mid-level Taliban commander operating in North Waziristan, had been killed in a drone strike. Intelligence sources confirmed it. Military spokesmen released statements. The news cycle moved on. But 3 months later, something impossible happened. Qari Ahmadullah appeared in a video, very much alive, mocking the reports of his death and promising continued resistance. The embarrassment was immediate. Intelligence agencies scrambled to explain. Had they misidentified the body? Had someone fed them false information? Or had Ahmadullah himself orchestrated an elaborate deception? Then, just as suddenly as he'd resurfaced, Qari Ahmadullah vanished again. Not in another drone strike, not in a firefight. He simply stopped appearing in Taliban communications. No videos, no audio messages, no claims of responsibility. By 2010, even his closest associates had gone silent about his whereabouts. And here's where the story fractures into something far stranger than a simple case of mistaken death. Because in the years that followed, conflicting reports emerged. Some claimed he'd been killed, again, this time for real. Others insisted he'd been captured by Pakistani intelligence and disappeared into a black site. A few whispered that he'd defected, cut a deal, and been relocated with a new identity. But nobody could agree on when any of this happened, or where, or why the truth kept changing. This is the story of a man who died twice, lived once in between, and then disappeared into a void where facts dissolve and certainty becomes a luxury no one can afford. Who was Qari Ahmadullah? To understand how a person can die, resurrect, and vanish, you first need to understand who Qari Ahmadullah was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. The title, Qari, indicates someone who has memorized the Quran, a position of religious respect in many Muslim communities. It's not a nom de guerre chosen for intimidation. It's a designation earned through years of study. This detail matters because it suggests that Ahmadullah's path to militancy didn't begin with violence. It began in a madrasa, somewhere in the Pashtun belt, likely during the 1990s when the region was already being reshaped by jihadi networks. We know frustratingly little about his early life. Unlike higher-profile Taliban leaders whose biographies have been reconstructed through defector testimonies and intelligence reports, Ahmadullah existed in that middle tier where documentation is sparse. He wasn't important enough to warrant extensive Western intelligence surveillance, but he was significant enough that his death, or supposed death, made the news. What we do know comes from fragmentary sources: Pakistani military briefings, Taliban propaganda materials, and occasional mentions in regional journalism. Ahmadullah was likely born in the early 1970s, possibly in the Mir Ali area of North Waziristan, a region that would later become synonymous with drone warfare. His religious education would have coincided with the Soviet-Afghan War when madrasas throughout Pakistan's tribal areas became recruiting grounds for the Mujahideen. By the mid-2000s, he'd emerged as a commander in the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban, which, despite its name, was a loose coalition of tribal militias, criminal networks, and ideological warriors. His specific responsibilities remain unclear, but intelligence assessments from the period suggest he was involved in coordinating attacks against Pakistani security forces and possibly facilitating the movement of foreign fighters into Afghanistan. He wasn't a household name. He didn't issue grandiose statements or appear in high-production propaganda videos. He was, by most accounts, a tactician and organizer, someone who made the violence happen rather than taking credit for it afterward. This relative anonymity makes what happened next all the more bizarre. The frontier, where death is currency and truth is negotiable. To understand how someone can be declared dead, resurface alive, and then disappear without resolution, You need to understand the place where this story unfolds. North Waziristan in 2008 was not merely a region experiencing conflict. It was a territory where the fundamental structures that usually help us determine truth, government authority, media access, forensic investigation, had completely broken down. The federally administered tribal areas, or FATA, operated under a colonial-era legal framework that denied residents basic constitutional rights afforded to other Pakistanis. The Pakistani state had limited authority here. Local governance fell to political agents and tribal maliks, a system designed by the British Empire to manage frontier populations with minimal investment. When the War on Terror arrived, this fragile structure collapsed entirely. By 2008, the region had become a patchwork of overlapping authorities and competing narratives. The Pakistani military conducted operations but couldn't hold territory. The Taliban established parallel governance structures, running courts and collecting taxes. American drones circled overhead. Strike decisions made thousands of miles away based on intelligence that was often sourced from paid informants with their own agendas. And underneath it all, traditional tribal codes of honor, revenge, and hospitality created social dynamics that outsiders rarely understood. In this environment, death itself became negotiable. When a drone strike hit a compound, who verified the casualties? If Pakistani intelligence claimed a commander was killed, what independent confirmation existed? The military couldn't send forensic teams into areas under Taliban control. Journalists couldn't access strike sites, and the Taliban had every incentive to either exaggerate their losses to claim martyrs or deny them to protect morale. Intelligence agencies relied on networks of human sources, tribal informants, captured militants, intercepted communications. But informants had their own motivations. A tribal rival might feed false information to get an enemy killed. A double agent might protect an asset by reporting him dead. And the fog of war, combined with the physical destruction caused by Hellfire missiles, made visual identification of remains difficult even when bodies could be recovered. The currency of reputation mattered intensely here. For the Taliban, martyrdom was propaganda gold. A fallen commander could be eulogized, his death used to recruit new fighters. But a living commander appearing after being declared dead, that was an intelligence victory. Proof that the Americans and Pakistanis didn't know what they were doing. The weather itself conspired to obscure truth. Winter in North Waziristan meant cold, mud, and limited visibility. Strikes happened at night. Compounds were often destroyed completely. Recovery operations, when they occurred at all, happened hours or days later. This was the world Qari Ahmadullah inhabited, a place where you could be killed in an official statement in the morning and alive in a propaganda video by evening, where disappearing didn't necessarily mean death, and death didn't necessarily mean the end of your story. The first death, December 2008. The strike came during Ramadan's aftermath, in the cooling weeks before winter fully descended on the tribal areas. On December 15, 2008, a Predator drone fired missiles at a compound in the Mir Ali area of North Waziristan. The target, according to Pakistani military sources who briefed journalists, was a gathering of Taliban commanders. Within hours, Pakistani intelligence sources began circulating names of the dead. Qari Ahmadullah was among them. The announcement followed a now familiar pattern. Military spokesmen would confirm a successful operation against militants. Intelligence sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, would provide names to journalists. Wire services would run brief stories. The international press, if they covered it at all, would publish a paragraph or two noting another commander eliminated in the ongoing campaign against terrorism. But here's what's critical to understand about these announcements. They rarely contained the level of detail that would allow for independent verification. No photographs of bodies, no DNA analysis, no surviving witnesses willing to speak on the record, just names on a list, attributed to intelligence sources. In Ahmadullah's case, the claim seemed plausible enough. He'd been operating in North Waziristan. The strike occurred in his area of operations. Intelligence presumably had intercepted communications placing him at that location. In the brutal arithmetic of counterterrorism, it counted as a win. The news was reported by Pakistani outlets and picked up by regional services. Some stories described Ahmadullah as a mid-level commander. Others used vaguer terms like Taliban operative. A few mentioned his religious title, but none questioned whether he was actually dead. For 3 months, Qari Ahmadullah's death was accepted as fact. Counterterrorism analysts updated their databases. Military briefing documents noted his elimination. His name might have appeared on slides in Pentagon presentations as evidence of progress. And then, in March 2009, he appeared on video, laughing at the news of his own demise. The Resurrection, a propaganda masterstroke. The video surfaced on Taliban-affiliated websites and jihadi forums in early March 2009. The production values were typical of Taliban media. Basic camera work, simple editing, a plain background. But the content was extraordinary. Qari Ahmadullah sat before the camera, very much alive, and delivered what can only be described as a trolling masterpiece. He acknowledged the reports of his death. He thanked Allah for protecting him, and then he mocked the intelligence agencies who had declared him killed, suggesting their incompetence extended far beyond this single case. The message was clear. If they can't even confirm who they've killed, how can anyone trust their broader claims about progress in the war? For the Taliban's propaganda apparatus, this was gold. It wasn't just proof of life, it was a humiliation of their enemies. The video circulated through jihadi networks and eventually reached mainstream Pakistani media. Journalists who had dutifully reported Ahmadullah's death 3 months earlier now had to report his resurrection. The Pakistani military's response was telling in its vagueness. Spokesmen suggested there might have been a misidentification. Intelligence sources quietly walked back their earlier certainty, but no one could explain exactly what had gone wrong. Had another militant been mistaken for Ahmadullah? Had he simply not been at the compound during the strike? Or had he intentionally spread false information about his presence to trigger the very embarrassment that now unfolded? The incident highlighted a fundamental problem in the drone war: confirmation bias in intelligence assessment. When you want to believe a target has been eliminated, it becomes easier to accept evidence that confirms that belief. An informant says Ahmadullah was in the compound. Communications intercepts suggest a meeting of commanders. The strike happens. Local sources report casualties. It's natural to conclude the target was among the dead. But in North Waziristan, local sources might be Taliban members feeding disinformation. Communications intercepts might be old or misattributed, and the physical evidence, the bodies themselves, might be impossible to examine. Ahmadullah's resurrection video didn't just embarrass intelligence agencies. It sowed doubt about every subsequent claim of a commander's death. If they got this one wrong, how many others were wrong? When a drone strike was reported as successful, could anyone be certain anymore? For Qari Ahmadullah himself, the video represented a peak. He'd achieved something rare. He'd beaten the drones and lived to tell about it. His status within Taliban circles likely increased. The propaganda value alone would have elevated his importance. But here's what's haunting about the video in retrospect. It's one of the last confirmed sightings of Qari Ahmadullah. The silence descends. After the resurrection video in March 2009, Qari Ahmadullah's presence in Taliban communications began to fade. Not abruptly. There were a few more mentions over the following months, references in statements, possibly another video appearance, though sources conflict on timing. But by late 2009 and into 2010, something changed. He stopped appearing. In the world of militant propaganda, this silence was unusual. Taliban commanders who successfully evaded death typically became more vocal, not less. They'd release periodic statements proving their continued survival, defying their enemies, maintaining morale among followers. The propaganda value of a resurrected commander should have been exploited for years. But Ahmadullah went quiet. At first, this might not have seemed significant. Commanders shifted locations, went operational, or laid low when surveillance intensified. Silence could be tactical. But as months stretched into years, the absence became conspicuous to those who tracked such things. By 2011, when journalists and researchers tried to determine Ahmadullah's status, they encountered a strange phenomenon. Nobody would definitively say what had happened to him. Taliban sources, when they addressed the question at all, were evasive. Some suggested he was still alive, operating quietly. Others implied he'd been martyred but offered no details. A few simply refused to discuss him. Pakistani intelligence sources were no more helpful. After the embarrassment of prematurely announcing his death, they seemed reluctant to make any definitive claims. Off the record, different officials told different stories. He'd been killed in a subsequent strike. He'd been captured. He'd been killed by rival militants in an internal dispute. But none of these claims came with evidence. What makes this silence particularly strange is the context of the time period. Between 2009 and 2012, drone strikes in North Waziristan intensified dramatically. The CIA was hitting targets with increasing frequency. Many Taliban commanders were killed, and their deaths were publicized both by intelligence agencies and by the Taliban themselves, who produced martyrdom videos and elaborate funeral ceremonies. If Ahmadullah had been killed in this period, why no announcement? Why no martyrdom video? The Taliban had turned the death of commanders into a sophisticated propaganda operation. A man who'd already died once and embarrassed the Americans would have made perfect martyr material. Unless he hadn't died at all. Theory 1. The second death. The most straightforward explanation for Qari Ahmadullah's disappearance is that he was, in fact, killed sometime between 2009 and 2011, and for various reasons, his death was never confirmed or publicized. This theory has several variations, each with its own logic. Variation A. Death in a drone strike. Perhaps Ahmadullah was killed in one of the many strikes that hit North Waziristan during this period, but his body was either not recovered or not identified. Drone strikes often resulted in casualties that couldn't be individually identified, especially when missiles destroyed compounds or hit vehicles. If Ahmadullah died in such a strike, local Taliban might have recovered partial remains, buried him quickly according to Islamic tradition, and never confirmed his identity to avoid giving their enemies a propaganda victory. This scenario is plausible because drone strikes created difficult forensic conditions. High-explosive warheads don't leave bodies intact. Multiple casualties in a single strike meant mass burials were common, and the Taliban had learned that announcing deaths gave intelligence agencies information about their organizational structure. But there's a problem with this theory. Why would the Taliban stay silent about the death of a commander who'd already scored a propaganda victory? If anything, Ahmadullah's story arc, declared dead, proven alive, then actually martyred, would have made for powerful recruitment material. A man who defied the drones once and eventually achieved Shahada would have been celebrated, not hidden. Variation AB. Death in internal violence. Another possibility is that Ahmadullah was killed not by drones or Pakistani forces, but by other militants. The Taliban and allied groups were not monolithic organizations. They included rival factions, criminal networks, and personal feuds wrapped in ideological justifications. Commanders were sometimes killed in internal disputes over territory, resources, or perceived betrayals. If Ahmadullah died this way, the silence makes more sense. The Taliban wouldn't want to publicize internal divisions or admit that one of their commanders had been killed by their own side. It would damage morale and give enemies ammunition for psychological operations. Intelligence sources have occasionally hinted at this possibility, suggesting Ahmadullah ran afoul of more powerful commanders or became entangled in tribal disputes that predated and transcended the Taliban's religious ideology. North Waziristan was rife with such conflicts where ancient grudges played out under the banner of jihad. But again, evidence is absent. No specific incident has been identified. No witnesses have come forward. And the very nature of such killings, done quietly, denied publicly, means verification may be impossible. Variation ici, death by capture and execution. A darker possibility is that Ahmadullah was captured, either by Pakistani intelligence or by allied tribal militias, and executed or died in custody. Pakistan's intelligence services, particularly the ISI, operated a network of detention facilities where suspected militants were held, interrogated, and sometimes killed. If Ahmadullah was taken to such a facility, he would have effectively disappeared. No trial, no public acknowledgement, no death certificate. Just a man who existed in official records as dead in 2008, alive in 2009, and then absent from all records thereafter. This theory gains some credibility from the pattern of enforced disappearances in Pakistan's tribal areas during this period. Human rights organizations documented thousands of cases where individuals were detained by security forces and never seen again. Some were militants. Others were civilians caught in sweeps or targeted by false accusations. The silence from both Taliban and Pakistani sources could indicate a mutual desire not to discuss what happened. The Taliban wouldn't want to admit one of their commanders had been captured and broken under interrogation. Pakistani intelligence wouldn't want to publicize extrajudicial detention and execution. But this remains speculation, built on the architecture of possibility rather than the foundation of evidence. Theory 2. The defection. A more intriguing theory suggests that Qari Ahmadullah didn't die at all. Instead, he defected, cut a deal with Pakistani intelligence, and was relocated with a new identity. This theory exists primarily in whispered conversations among journalists and researchers who've covered the region. It's never been confirmed, but it persists because it explains certain anomalies in the case. Consider the timing. Ahmadullah's resurrection video in March 2009 would have made him valuable to intelligence agencies. He'd humiliated them, yes, but he'd also demonstrated something important. He had access to Taliban media networks and could shape narratives. A man like that, if he could be turned, would be an extraordinary asset. The drone program relied heavily on human intelligence. Targeting required knowing where commanders would be, when they'd be there, and who else might be present. This information came from sources inside militant networks. Defectors, double agents, captured militants who'd agreed to cooperate. What if Ahmadullah became one of those sources? The scenario would go something like this. After his resurrection video, Ahmadullah attracted increased attention from intelligence agencies. Perhaps through intermediaries, perhaps through family members, contact was established. An offer was made: safety, money, relocation in exchange for information and cooperation. Maybe he'd grown disillusioned with the Taliban's increasingly brutal tactics. Maybe he'd seen too many friends killed. Maybe he simply wanted out. Or maybe the offer was combined with threats against his family, a classic intelligence recruitment tactic. If he agreed, his disappearance would have to be absolute. The Taliban execute defectors and their families. He couldn't simply vanish. He'd need a plausible cover, perhaps another false death announcement, this time more quietly circulated. Perhaps a staged capture that left ambiguity about whether he'd been killed or taken alive, and then relocation. Pakistan? Another country? Under what identity? Doing what? This theory explains why both Taliban and Pakistani sources are silent. The Taliban wouldn't want to admit they'd been penetrated by someone close to their propaganda apparatus. Pakistani intelligence wouldn't want to compromise an asset or reveal their methods. But it's important to emphasize this is speculation. No defector has ever come forward claiming to be Ahmadullah. No intelligence leaks have confirmed such a recruitment. The theory exists because it's possible, not because it's proven. Theory 3. The quiet retirement. The least dramatic theory is also, perhaps, the most human. Maybe Qari Ahmadullah simply walked away, not through defection or deals with intelligence agencies, but through personal choice. He left the Taliban, returned to his tribe, took a new name and lived the rest of his life in obscurity. This happens more often than people realize. Not every militant stays militant until death. Some grow weary. Some see their cause as lost. Some accumulate enough money through crime or kidnapping to retire comfortably. Others find religious justifications for laying down arms and reintegrating into civilian life. In the Pashtun tribal areas, reintegration is complicated but not impossible. If Ahmadullah had tribal connections and hadn't committed unforgivable crimes against his own people, he might have been able to negotiate a quiet exit, pay blood money for any killings that demanded compensation, make amends with tribal elders, renounce violence publicly enough to satisfy local authority but privately enough not to attract Taliban assassins, then disappear into the vast, undocumented population of the tribal belt. Maybe he runs a small shop now. Maybe he drives a truck. Maybe he's a farmer. Maybe he's married with children who have no idea what their father once was. The romantic appeal of this theory is obvious, the weary warrior laying down his weapon and finding peace, but it's also consistent with the evidence such as it is. The lack of death announcements, the absence from propaganda materials, the evasive answers from those who might know. If Ahmadullah simply quit, both the Taliban and intelligence agencies would have reason to stay quiet. The Taliban wouldn't want to acknowledge that commanders could just walk away. It would encourage others to do the same. Intelligence agencies, meanwhile, might leave him alone if he'd truly left violence behind and wasn't worth the effort of pursuing. But again, we're left with the same problem. No proof, no confirmation, only the logic of possibility. The information void and what it tells us. What's most striking about Qari Ahmadullah's case isn't any single theory about his fate. It's the absolute void of reliable information about what actually happened. In the decade and a half since his disappearance, no journalist has produced a definitive investigation. No intelligence leak has revealed his fate. No former Taliban member has come forward with a credible account. No body has been identified. No grave has been found. This void itself is information. It tells us something about the nature of the conflict that consumed the tribal areas and the people caught within it. First, it reveals the profound lack of accountability in the drone program and counterterrorism operations more broadly. When someone is declared dead and then appears alive, there should be systematic investigation into how the error occurred. When someone subsequently disappears without explanation, their fate should be determinable through forensic investigation, intelligence records, or witness accounts. But in North Waziristan, none of these mechanisms functioned reliably. The region existed in a state of informational chaos where death announcements were sometimes true, sometimes false, and sometimes impossible to verify. Where human lives became data points in intelligence assessments that were often wrong but rarely corrected. Second, the void demonstrates the Taliban's sophisticated understanding of information control. By staying silent about Ahmadullah's fate, they maintained ambiguity that served multiple purposes. If he'd defected, silence prevented others from learning defection was possible. If he'd been killed in an internal dispute, silence prevented morale damage. If he was still alive and operating, silence protected him from targeting. Third, it shows how individuals can be erased from history when institutions fail to document and preserve truth. Qari Ahmadullah was a real person with a biography, motivations, fears, and desires. But the systems that should have created a record of his life and death, government documentation, journalism, legal proceedings, all failed. What we're left with is a ghost, a man who existed in confirmed form only for a brief moment in 2009, when he appeared on video to mock his own declared death. Before that moment and after it, he dissolves into rumor and speculation. The unanswered questions that haunt this case. Certain details about Qari Ahmadullah's story refuse to rest quietly. They nag at anyone who examines the case closely, suggesting there's more to this disappearance than simple death or defection. Why was the resurrection video never followed up? Ahmadullah's March 2009 video was a propaganda goldmine. The Taliban's media operations were sophisticated enough to understand this. Yet there's no evidence they produced follow-up videos featuring him. Why not? If he was alive and available, the logical move would be to keep using him to embarrass intelligence agencies. The fact that he wasn't used suggests something changed rapidly after that video, but what? Who actually died in the December 2008 strike? If Ahmadullah wasn't killed in that strike, someone was. Multiple casualties were reported. Were all of them misidentified? Or was Ahmadullah's name added to the list for reasons unrelated to the actual strike? Intelligence sources presumably had some basis for claiming he was dead. What was that basis, and how did it turn out to be wrong? Why do Taliban sources give conflicting accounts? When researchers have attempted to track down information about Ahmadullah's fate, they've encountered not silence but contradiction. Different Taliban sources tell different stories. This isn't typical for cases where someone is simply dead or has defected. It suggests either deliberate disinformation or genuine confusion within Taliban ranks about what happened to him. What happened to his family? In Pashtun tribal society, families are central to identity and community standing. Qari Ahmadullah presumably had relatives, parents, siblings, possibly a wife and children. What do they say happened to him? Have they been questioned? Have they maintained silence out of fear, loyalty, or genuine ignorance? The complete absence of family testimony in this case is itself strange. Usually, families of disappeared persons become advocates, demanding answers or at least acknowledgement. The silence here suggests either the family knows what happened and has been convinced or coerced into silence, or they've been so thoroughly isolated that no researcher or journalist has been able to reach them. Why won't Pakistani intelligence clarify the record? After the embarrassment of the 2008 death announcement, Pakistani intelligence has been remarkably evasive about Ahmadullah. They could simply say, "We got it wrong, he wasn't in that strike, and we don't know what happened to him afterward." Instead, they've offered vague hints and conflicting statements. This sustained evasiveness suggests there's something they don't want known. But what? Where the case stands now, as of 2026, Qari Ahmadullah's status remains officially unresolved. He's not listed among confirmed Taliban deaths. He's not known to be in custody anywhere. He hasn't appeared in any propaganda materials in over 15 years. He exists in official records primarily as a footnote. The commander, who was declared dead, appeared alive, and then disappeared into the category of unknown fate. Pakistani security forces, when asked, generally indicate they have no current information about him. Taliban sources, on the rare occasions when they're pressed, offer contradictory accounts or refuse to discuss him at all. International counterterrorism databases list him variously as deceased, status unknown, or inactive. There's no ongoing investigation into his disappearance that's been made public. No family members have filed legal petitions demanding information. No human rights organizations have taken up his case as an example of enforced disappearance, probably because his status as a militant makes him an unsympathetic subject for such advocacy. The drone strikes that may or may not have killed him have long since ended in their previous intensity. North Waziristan has changed dramatically since the period when Ahmadullah was active. Pakistani military operations eventually brought some degree of government control to the region. Many Taliban commanders who operated there are now confirmed dead, captured, or integrated into peace processes. But Ahmadullah's fate remains in limbo. trapped in that strange category of modern disappearances where technology has created unprecedented surveillance capabilities while simultaneously creating new ways for people to vanish without trace. What this case reveals about modern conflict. Qari Ahmadullah's story, despite its specific context in the Pakistan-Afghanistan tribal areas, reveals broader truths about how people disappear in the 21st century. We live in an age of unprecedented documentation. Every cell phone is a camera. Satellites photograph the Earth continuously. Digital communications create permanent records. Biometric databases track identities. And yet, people still vanish. They vanish not in spite of this documentation, but sometimes because of it. The same technologies that should make disappearance impossible also create new categories of uncertainty. A man can be declared dead based on drone footage, and signals intelligence appear alive in a digital video and then disappear again, leaving no forensic trace. The Ahmadullah case also reveals how conflict zones become zones of narrative collapse, where competing power structures produce incompatible versions of truth. The Pakistani state says one thing, Taliban sources say another, intelligence agencies offer a third account, and there's no authoritative institution with the power and credibility to determine which version is correct. This narrative collapse has consequences beyond individual cases. It undermines accountability. It makes war crimes harder to prosecute because establishing basic facts becomes impossible. It allows intelligence agencies to operate without effective oversight because their claims can never be definitively verified or refuted. For families of the disappeared, whether militants or civilians, this narrative collapse creates a special kind of hell. They exist in permanent uncertainty, unable to mourn because death isn't confirmed, unable to hope because life isn't proven. The final questions. Somewhere, the truth about Qari Ahmadullah exists. Either he's alive or he's dead. Either he's living under a new identity or his bones rest in an unmarked grave, or his remains were scattered by a missile strike and are beyond recovery. Someone knows what happened. Either family members who've kept silent, or Taliban commanders who've chosen not to speak, or intelligence officials who've classified the information, or Ahmadullah himself, if he's still alive and reading these words. But that truth remains inaccessible to the rest of us. We're left with fragments, a death announcement that was false, a video that was real, and then silence. And in that silence, Qari Ahmadullah exists in a strange state of quantum uncertainty. He's simultaneously dead and alive, victim and defector, martyr and traitor, depending on who's telling the story and what they need to believe. Was he killed in a drone strike that was never confirmed? Did he die at the hands of rival militants in a power struggle no one wants to discuss? Did he cut a deal with intelligence agencies and disappear into witness protection? Did he simply walk away from violence and return to a quiet life in some village where no one knows his past? Or is there another explanation entirely, one that hasn't been considered because the truth is stranger than any of the theories? The case of Qari Ahmadullah remains open not because evidence is still being gathered, but because the evidence never existed in the first place. He's disappeared not into death, but into the void between competing narratives, where facts dissolve and certainty becomes impossible. And perhaps that's the most disturbing thing about this case. Not that we don't know what happened to Qari Ahmadullah, but that we may never know, that in the chaotic intersection of drone warfare, tribal politics, and information warfare, a human being can simply cease to exist in any verifiable way. He was declared dead. He proved himself alive, and then he disappeared. And no one, it seems, knows where he went, or, if anyone does know, they're not telling. Qari Ahmadullah, wherever you are, dead or alive, free or imprisoned, remembered or forgotten, your story remains unfinished, suspended in the terrible uncertainty that defines so many lives caught in the machinery of modern conflict. The question isn't just what happened to you. The question is whether, in a world like this, we can ever really know what happened to anyone.